Thank you for joining us today, and we're going to be exploring getting started with research in Baden-Wurttemberg in that area of Germany. We will be exploring finding your town of origin within this region, vital records, immigration, utilizing censuses for clues, religious records, and records that you can access online. And at the end, we'll talk about resources that we have available here at the Genealogy Center too. And I set this presentation up as sort of a case study, so that's how we'll kind of move through it today. So first, a little bit of history. So Baden-Württemberg is a federal state located in the southwestern part of Germany, and it was formed in 1952 through a merger of the states of Baden, Württemberg, and Hohenzollern. So I know my pronunciation is off there, but so that was formed after World War II, and it has a rich history dating back to medieval times and influenced by various rulers. So geographically, it's bordered by France to the west, Switzerland to the south, Bavaria to the east, and the state of Hessen to the north. And the state features diverse landscapes, including the Black Forest and fertile plains along the Rhine River. So its kind of central location in Europe has made it an important area for trade, culture, and migration over the centuries. And for genealogy research, Baden-Württemberg's historical significance means that records are plentiful, but they can sometimes be complex. So the region has diverse historical influences, French, Swabian, Bavarian, and others. So that can lead to a mix of record-keeping traditions. And key resources for genealogists are going to include church records, baptisms, marriages, and burials, some civil records, and land registers. And the varying administrative systems for this region over time can sometimes make it challenging to trace ancestors. So the creation of the state that we know today in 1952, along with the previous boundary changes, means that the research might involve different archives and jurisdictions for individuals from different areas around the region. So the close proximity to neighboring countries can also add a little bit of complexity to tracing family lines across some of those borders. But the first step with any kind of genealogical research is to identify what you know. So although it can be very tempting and exciting to jump into international records right away to search for your ancestors in Germany, you want to research them as much as you can in the United States first, uncover everything you can about their lives there, and that'll make your research in Germany much easier. So asking yourself, what do you know about your grandparents and great-grandparents, where they lived, what was the family's religious tradition, do you know who the immigrant ancestor was, when did they arrive? Do you know the ship's name? Any family documents laying around that might provide clues or town names? So all of these variables and puzzle pieces work together to create a more complete picture of your family's story. And so to start off our case study today, William Schmid going to be who we'll start with, and we're going to trace his line back to Germany. So these are the things that we know so far. He was born in 1886, and he married Margaret Maloney in 1907 in Claremont County, Ohio, and they had 3 children, Charles, Albert, and Helen. They divorced, and he married Stella Feth in 1920, and they had no children together and divorced. And then in 1922, he married Mary Kruger in Cincinnati, and they had 1 daughter together, Ruth. Mary died in 1933, and then William died in 1957. So first I took a look at William in various censuses and looked there to see what clues we can pick up. So starting with the most recent censuses, 1950 and 1940, he's living in Hamilton County, Ohio, and he says that his birthplace is Germany. In 1930, he says he naturalized and immigrated in 1915. And then in 1920, he says that his parents were from Baden and they immigrated in 1890. And then going back further, in 1910, we found him in Claremont County, Ohio, and in 1900, we found him there again. And he's 14 and with his parents. And it's hard to make out the handwriting on that census, but his parents' names appear to be listed as Abel and Lena Schmid. So there are several siblings in the house with him: Matthew, Emma, Albert, Frank, and Joseph. And comparing all of this information, we can identify some outlying pieces. So the 1915 year of immigration provided in the 1930 census doesn't seem plausible, since we do find him living in the US in 1900 and 1910. And there are a couple of variations in the spelling of the name, Schmid with a T at the end and Smith rather than Schmid. And the birth year ranges between 1885 and 1888, but some of those variations are pretty common in censuses. And we get a potential clue of Baden as the birthplace of his parents. So next, we'll take a look at William's death certificate. Ohio death certificates are available on Family Search currently through 1953. So I ordered his certificate since he died a little later in 1957. And his birthplace is listed as Germany, and his parents are listed as Albert Schmid and Helen Beckley. So these names are slightly different than who we see him with on the 1900 census, but pretty similar. So switching gears a little bit, church records are very valuable, and they often contain hidden clues that can help in your research and getting you back to Germany. So if you're tracing your immigrant ancestors in Baden-Wurttemberg, the records are likely to be either Catholic or Lutheran. So to find church records in the US, you'll want to start by identifying the denomination, which you might be able to determine from a marriage record, an obituary, or a reference to the church in a funeral notice. So in my case, I can confirm this from William's death certificate, which indicates that he was buried in a Catholic cemetery. And once you know that, you can begin to locate the church records. So many churches maintain their own records, but some may be deposited in regional archives. And many church records are available online through Ancestry, Family Search, and Find My Past. Family Search in particular has an extensive collection from various denominations. So depending on the town or city, you'll want to check there to see what's available. And if the church is still active, you can always contact them directly. So for older or smaller congregations, local archives and libraries might hold those records. So it's worth exploring all of those resources to determine where the records ended up. When you are seeking out church records on Family Search or other types of records, the catalog is the place to go. It's hidden there under the search button. And you'll want to search for the state and county and the town or city where your ancestors lived. And in this case, I stuck with my Cincinnati example. And under the church records category, you can then explore all of the listings for digitized records in that location that you're researching to see if your ancestors' church might be among those listed. And in this case, we have 83 different collections to browse through to see if I can find the church I'm looking for. So from there, you'll be able to explore available baptismal, marriage, death, or other sacramental records. And Find My Past, again, is an additional database that's helpful for uncovering church records, especially if your ancestors happen to be Catholic. So Find My Past is free here when you're at the Genealogy Center, and they've partnered with a number of Catholic dioceses in the US, including Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Cincinnati. And Find My Past is where I found this 1922 marriage for William Schmid and Mary Kruger. And William lists his parents here as Albert Schmid and Helen Beckley. And his previous marriage to Stella also listed Albert and Helen as his parents. And these names, again, slightly differ from how they appear when William was listed with them on the 1900 census, but now we have enough records to correlate to prove who his parents are. And so we have his death certificate, again, that lists the parents' names, 2 of the 3 marriage records, which all list Albert and Helen. So we feel confident in their names and want to look more closely at records for them. So I started again with censuses like I did for William. And the first census that we found them in was 1900. And that was the only census where William was living with them. But as early as 1900, Albert said that he was naturalized, and he continued to say this through each of his censuses. And the 1920 census stands out because they both stated that they were from Württemberg specifically, rather than just Germany. And a couple of slides ago on the 1920 census for William, he stated that they were from Baden. So that differs a little bit, but we have the region narrowed down. So, but I would be more inclined to believe that the information coming directly from Albert and Helen, since their son William was so young when the family immigrated. So then in the 1930 census, Albert says that they immigrated about 1890. So that's another good clue. And then we'll also look at their death certificates. So Helen died in 1934, and her husband Albert was the informant. He stated that her father was Anthony Buckley, and her mother was named Helen, and they were both born in Germany. Albert followed her in death a few years later in 1937, and one of his sons was the informant on the death certificate. Albert's father is listed as Matthias Schmid, and his mother's first name was unknown, but he listed her maiden name as Decker. So both Albert and Helen were buried at St. Andrew's Catholic Cemetery. And before we jump over to Germany, we're still on a quest to learn as much as we can about their lives in the US first. So looking at naturalization, in the 1900 census, Albert said he was naturalized, and Claremont County naturalizations are digitized, and those are available on Family Search for this time period. So that was the first thing I looked at. Albert naturalized in 1896, and these earlier naturalizations only give a country of origin, not the town or the region. So Germany is the only piece of information that we get here, but if your ancestors immigrated or naturalized after 1906, when it became a federal process, there will probably be a town mentioned along with some other more detailed information. So Albert does say that he came to the United States on or about May 25th, 1891. So that'll be an important clue when we look for his passenger list. And before we get to the passenger list, we'll talk about immigration from Baden-Württemberg to the US. So in the 18th century, there was early Palatine migration, and one of the factors that played into that was religious persecution. During the 18th century, many residents of Baden-Württemberg, particularly Protestants, faced religious intolerance in predominantly Catholic regions. And economic hardship was another factor. Wars like the 30 Years' War and the War of Spanish Succession devastated the region. So that caused famine and poverty. So that brought the first wave to America. Many immigrants from Baden-Württemberg were part of the larger Palatine migration to Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. And the Pennsylvania Dutch community includes descendants from this wave. And looking at the 19th century, in the early 1800s, Napoleonic invasions displaced populations and disrupted local economies. And the Napoleonic Code and land inheritance practices often left younger sons without property, so that encouraged a lot of immigration out of Germany during that time. The 1830s through the 1850s saw political unrest across Europe, leading to increased immigration. Settlers during this period often moved to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, and Wisconsin, and they were seeking land and farming opportunities. And then by the late 1800s, Baden-Württemberg's population exceeded its resources, so that led to a lot of economic pressure. And while some regions industrialized, more rural areas were behind the game, and that led to job shortages. So these factors led to immigration to the US, along with chain migration. So established German American communities encouraged friends and family to follow. And in the 1860s through 1880s, during these industrial era migrations, people flocked especially to urban centers like Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Milwaukee. And there were also groups who went to Texas, specifically to the Hill Country. And by the 1890s, immigration decreased due to the stricter immigration laws. And at that at that time, things were starting to improve a bit in Germany. And ports of departure included Bremen and Hamburg in Germany, Le Havre, France, and Antwerp, Belgium. And ports of arrival, from most common to least, were New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Galveston. So while we're talking about immigration, I also wanted to mention occupations. So in Baden-Württemberg, many were small-scale farmers growing crops like wheat, barley, oats, and potatoes. Livestock farming, particularly dairy cattle, was also common, as were working in vineyards. Skilled trades like blacksmithing, weaving, woodworking, and shoemaking, those were also common. And proximity to the Black Forest meant forestry and timber occupations too. So the tradition of farming continued in the new country in the United States, and many immigrants sought land in the Midwest for that reason. Immigrants who'd worked on vineyards back home sought this out in America too, which is why there was a group that went to the Texas Hill Country. So skilled trades translated pretty easily in urban settings, and German immigrants often worked as bakers, butchers, blacksmiths, or carpenters, or they would work in machinery and manufacturing. And entrepreneurship is also key. So they brought skills in brewing and established breweries in cities like Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, and transformed the US beer industry. And moving to passenger lists, when searching for your ancestors, it's always a good idea to try a variety of databases. So different sites have different search algorithms, so your ancestors might pop up right away when searching on one site and not on another. And there are lots of collections within Ancestry and Family Search that you can utilize to track down these passenger lists. There's also the Ellis Island website that you can use to search, and there's a website by Steve Morse, which is pictured in the screenshot there at the right. So the tools on his site fetch data from databases like Family Search and Ancestry, but they're designed to do so in more versatile ways than the search tools provided on those websites. So that can be a great way to search for your ancestors and passenger lists as well. And these are a few additional things that might help in searching for your ancestors, along with using a variety of databases. Narrow your search by date, the date range that aligns with the immigrant's estimated year of arrival. Try alternate spellings and name variations. Names were often recorded phonetically or Americanized by the immigrants themselves upon arrival, so be sure to try different spellings. For example, Johann versus John, and vice versa. You could also try just searching under the last name and first initial. Another method would be to use wildcards. So that's usually an asterisk or a question mark if you're maybe not sure how the immigrant's name could have been recorded in records. So for example, Jen with an asterisk could return results like Jennifer, Jenny, Jenna. And you'll also want to use advanced search options. So along with narrowing down the arrival year, you could filter by occupation, nationality, or other criteria like that. And then check for published indexes and transcriptions. And you'll want to verify that information by viewing the original records whenever that's possible. So using the clue from Albert's Naturalization, which was an arrival date of May 25th, 1891, I found a passenger list for the family. And they departed from Antwerp, Belgium, and arrived in Philadelphia, and the name is spelled Schmid with a T instead of Schmid, but looking at the names and ages and their intended destination of Cincinnati, I can be sure that it's them. So Albert's there with his wife, who's listed as Helena, and she went by Helen when she came to America. And then their sons, Wilhelm and Matthias, who became William and Matthew. And then if we look above, Matthias and Helen Schmid were also with them. And we saw Matthias was listed as Albert's father on his death certificate, and his mother was unnamed. So we can pretty confidently assume that these are his parents, but we'll still want to verify that with other records. And sometimes, even when searching in multiple databases with multiple spellings, you still might not have luck. Some of them are trickier than others, so there is a set of books here at the Genealogy Center called Germans to America, and they are lists of German passengers arriving at U.S. ports. And there are 67 volumes, and they're organized chronologically beginning in 1850, and there's a name index in the back of each one. So that might be a helpful tool. And these are also a few books that you might find helpful. So Bridget Burkett has written books on Baden-Wurttemberg immigration in the 18th and 19th centuries. The yellow book is immigrants from the Kingdom of Württemberg before 1850. And there's a couple listed there in the handout from our collection that might be helpful. And we also have a sizable collection of German Ortssippenbuch and Ortsfamilienbuch. And these typically document birth, marriage, and death details for people within a specific locality over a certain time frame. So they often trace back to the earliest records available for that area and extend up to more recent years. So starting dates can vary, but they commonly begin in the 16th or 17th century. So those can be a valuable resource for German family research. So this is a summary of a bit of what we did and what you can do to research your family in the US before jumping back into Germany. We covered church records, vital records, naturalization, censuses, and depending on the family, you might find more or less information in various types of records. If you have access to things like funeral cards, letters, diaries, those can also be a big help, but we've got lots of good names, dates, and hints that we can use. And like we mentioned a little bit ago, William said in the 1920 census that his parents were from Baden, but on their own enumeration sheet from 1920, Albert and Helen said that they were from Württemberg. So we're probably more inclined to trust the information that's coming directly from them, since William was only about 5 when they immigrated. And if you do a little digging into immigration patterns in the area where your ancestors settled, that can be helpful too. So doing this, I found that the majority of German immigrants to the Cincinnati area during the 19th century came from the region of Württemberg rather than Baden, and that makes me more confident too. So now we can try to jump across the pond. So this is a kind of rough illustration of the administrative organization of Germany, and it might be helpful when you're looking for records. So I'm not going to try to pronounce the German words for each, but the first is the local level, which will be your town or your village. And then there's the district and then the state level. So there are 16 federal states in modern day Germany, and Baden-Württemberg is one of them. And then there is the federal level. So for right now, for this case study, we know the state and federal, but we need to zoom in to find the district and the local level or the town name. And then this is another little map showing the 35 districts within Baden-Württemberg. And so we can keep that in mind as we keep going as well. So for records in Germany, civil registration are records of birth, marriage, and death. And civil registration records for both Baden and Württemberg begin in 1876. And most of those records remain at the local civil registration office, but some of them may be in city or state archives. And currently for birth records, those are public after 110 years. Marriages is after 80 years, and death is after 30. So you might find some civil registration records within the Family Search Catalog using the format to search there, but there might not be a lot because of the amount of time that has to elapse for a lot of those records, considering they began in 1876. So you can write to the Civil Registration Office to obtain some of those. So considering this, church records are probably going to be your best bet for tracing your ancestors in this region. So the consistent recording of church records was a slow, gradual process, and generally Lutherans began recording records around the mid-1500s. For Catholics, parish records were mandated by the Pope in 1563, and some church records were destroyed during various conflicts, like the 30 Years' War and World War II caused the destruction of some church records, particularly Lutheran records in areas that later became modern Poland. So you can find church records in a few places. One is through the Family Search Catalog, which contains both Lutheran and Catholic records, and that'll depend on the town. If your ancestors were Lutheran, you'll want to check out Archeon. It's a subscription site, but it contains lots of church records there. And there are several collections available for Baden, but none available for Württemberg at this time on Archeon. And if your ancestors are Catholic, Matricula is a website you'll want to explore. They've been making an effort to put more and more records from Baden-Württemberg online, and there's a decent collection there, and Matricula is a free website. And if you have Catholics from other parts of Germany in your tree, you'll want to check Matricula there too for those records. So as I'm trying to jump across the pond and find these people in Germany, I know they said they were from Württemberg, but they didn't leave anything more specific like a town or a district. So I'm going to have to search a little bit more broadly than I might prefer. So fortunately, Family Search offers an extensive collection of records from the Diocese of Rottenburg-Stuttgart, which encompasses the same geographic area as the former Kingdom of Württemberg. So I started with Albert, William's father, and entered his birth year of 1865, his wife's name, Helen or Helena, and his father, Matthias. So entering that information, I located the marriage record for Albert and Helena, and just analyzing the indexed information, we can see that Albert's name is listed there at the top, born in 1864, and his parents are listed as Matthias Schmid and Helena Decker, which matches the names on his Ohio death certificate and their 1891 passenger list when they were headed from Germany to Cincinnati. So if we look at the event date, October 7th, 1890, that's a slight head scratcher because I know that their two oldest children, William and Matthew, were born in 1886 and 1888. So we can kind of assume from this record that their first couple of children were illegitimate because they were not married until 1890. So the other clue that we get is an area down there at the bottom, Freudenstadt. So that helps us to narrow it down further, and to learn the town name and further analyze the record, we'll need to look at the original. So this is the marriage record zoomed in, and we can see Albert is listed at the top, then Helena Juliana, and I don't read German, but there are some tools that we can use to help us kind of decipher it. So the first thing is the Family Search Wiki. You'll want to search for the German genealogical word list, and on the right is a snippet from that page. So you can use that page to familiarize yourself with words that you might find commonly in genealogical records: birth, marriage, death, mother, father, month, day, things like that. You can also use Google Translate, DeepL, or other AI tools like ChatGPT, which will allow you to upload a limited number of files on their free plan, and you can ask it to translate them for you. So AI tools have a little bit tougher time with handwritten documents, but you can use them as translation aids to help you get an idea of what things say. And just remember that none of them are foolproof. So there are also German genealogy and translation groups on Facebook and platforms like that, so you may want to look at those too to help supplement. So going back to our record, some are easier to read than others, and this one, fortunately, the script is nice and spaced out, so it makes it a little bit easier to read. So left to right, Albert Schmid, then it gives us his occupation where the red arrow is pointing, Holzfäller, which means woodcutter, and his town of residence is next to the pink arrow, Zweiselberg. So now we have a town, which makes a big difference in finding additional records and tracing the family back. And below that, it indicates that he's Catholic. And then in the next column, where the orangey yellow arrow is pointing, it says son of Matthias Schmid. Bürger, which means citizen in German, and residence Zweiselberg, and Helena Decker. So son of Matthias Schmid and Helena Decker, both of Zweiselberg. And at the far right, where the blue arrow is, that tells us that Albert was born in Zweiselberg on December 25th, 1864. And so we get similar information in the row below for Helena. She's listed as Helena Juliana, Catholic from Zweiselberg. Her mother was also named Helena, so lots of Helenas going on. And Helena Juliana was born June 2nd, 1864 in Zweiselberg. And I'm confident that this is the correct record because of the parents who were listed for Albert and Helena's mother, who was also listed on her Ohio death certificate, and because the birth dates of Albert and Helena exactly match the birth dates that they provided on multiple records when they were in the US. So with that marriage record, we get a location of marriage for Albert and Helena and locations of birth, which is Zweiselberg for all of these events. And this is the listing of the town in Meyer's Gazetteer, and that's a geographical dictionary published that's helpful because it provides detailed information about towns, villages, and what was in the German Empire, and it gives us place names, so exact spellings, and it can indicate the presence of churches and historical boundaries and administrative divisions, things like that. So we've got all the elements, but when you're looking at this, you want to keep in mind the modern versus historical boundaries. So in the past, Weisselberg was the little village where they lived. Freudenstadt would have been the larger town that served as more of an administrative and economic center. And then I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but Schwarzwald Bar Kreis, which means Black Forest District. That would have been the district. And then Württemberg. So at one time, the Kingdom of Württemberg, and later the German Empire. And in today's geopolitical landscape, it's a village within the district of Freudenstadt in the state of Baden-Wurttemberg in the Federal Republic of Germany. So that's a mouthful, but all of that is just good to know to be able to pinpoint the location on a modern map versus historical, and to be able to search for additional records depending on when your ancestors lived in the area. And then here at the right is a snippet from the district of Freudenstadt's website, which says that it has a total of 64 inhabitants today. So it talks a little bit about the geography and the close proximity of the Black Forest. And then at the bottom mentions its origins, which date back to 1696 when woodcutter families settled there. So that makes sense, since the record we looked at previously mentioned that Albert worked as a woodcutter. And then it says that in 1926, that was when Zweiselberg was politically incorporated into Freudenstadt. So before we look at other records, I wanted to go back to church records for a minute and identifying those. So if your ancestors were Catholic, you can look for the diocese that would correspond to the area where they lived. So it's probably going to be either the Diocese of Rottenburg-Stuttgart for Württemberg or the Archdiocese of Freiburg for Baden. And you can do some broader keyword searches within these record collections on Family Search, but that's not always the most efficient. So if you're able to narrow it down further, if you know the town, that'll be the most helpful. And within the Family Search catalog, you can search by state and district. So sometimes if you search by town, you might be in luck if it's a larger town, but if it's a tiny village, that might be a little too specific. Our results in the catalog for that area include several church records, and the first one those are Evangelical or Lutheran Church Register excerpts, and those are compiled by someone named Max Kramer. Then we have two sets of church records, so you'll want to look for the record sets that list the churches as the authors to grab the originals. So the first set of records are Lutheran Church Book 1602 to 1875 for Freudenstadt, and then there are Catholic Church Books 1860 to 1900. Clicking on the Lutheran records, we can see what's available within the film, various baptisms, marriages, and deaths. So some of the information here tells us that there are source books that replace records some of which were previously burned. So even though here we selected online images, there was a warning sign next to the little camera symbol that we see on this page. So the images have locks over them here. So it'll tell you that you can view these images by visiting one of their partner sites or the legal record custodian. So sometimes you can view these record sets within a family search center close to you. That might be an option. And other times, depending on the record collection, you may have trouble viewing the images directly on family search. So if that happens to you, check Archeon. So again, that's a subscription-based site, and it's dedicated to Lutheran records, and they have all of the records here for this particular area, and this is just a short snippet from that list. And then here's the page for the Catholic records. So you can click the link at the very top in red to keyword search, or you can browse the film by clicking on the camera at the bottom. Now we'll look at some other records. So this one is a baptism for Albert Schmid. So we see his name there at the left. And then as we move across the page and start to decipher, there are some words that we can recognize from the previous marriage record, like his father, Matthias, citizen and woodcutter. And then if you look specifically where the red arrow is pointing, it says Obersweisselberg. Ober refers to the geographical position, which Ober means upper in German. So this refers to the part of Zweiselberg that's maybe at a higher elevation or would be considered upstream if it was in a valley. So if it said unter, which means lower in German, it would refer to a part that's at a lower elevation or downstream. So then it says Helena, born Decker, referring to his mother. And then some of the names are easier to make out, but if you look at Helena, their H looks like a Z. So having some examples of the alphabet in German script next to you or open in another tab might be helpful when you're working on deciphering some of the records. And on the right, it says Obersweisselberg again, born on December 25th, 1864. So like his marriage record reflected. And then I had to chop this one up, but if we look at the bottom, it continues and mentions the godparents, Nicholas and Marianne. So this is the marriage record between Matthias Schmid and Helena Decker. And I had to chop this one up too to fit it on the side, and this one's long, so we won't read through the whole thing, but we get their names in the margins along with the location of Obersweisselberg, and near their names are their birth dates, 1832 for Matthias and 1834 for Helena. And we get their parents' names. Matthias's parents are Gregor Schmid and Maria Juliana Schneider, and Helena's parents are Johannes Decker and Cecilia Schrimp. And on the very bottom is the marriage date, October 28th, 1858. So, and there's a lot more in that record, occupations and different locations and things, but that's just some of the vital information. And then it gets a little trickier with this one. So this is an 1832 marriage, and it's older German script. It's a lot closer together. The letters are smaller. So that one might take a little longer and a little more patience, but still doable to kind of decipher and get the important information from there. Back to William's parents, Albert and Helena. We found his baptism, Albert's baptism, so I started looking for Helena's baptism. And based on her records in the United States and the German marriage record, I know she was born June 2nd, 1864 in Obersweisselberg, and it's a tiny place, so I thought her baptism would be easy to find. And most records spell her maiden name Buckley, like at the top of this slide, but some records spell it more like Beckley, Beckley. So I looked under those spellings and I didn't find her. And I looked under various spellings of her first name. I searched without a first name and just included the last name and vice versa. I searched by typing in some neighboring towns and I looked everywhere and I couldn't find it. So then I finally found her and her sister Maria, and they were both baptized under their mother's maiden name, which was also Schmid. And that's because they were both illegitimate. So, researching the family a little more, I found that her mother did marry Anton Bockley and had more children that were given the Bockley surname. But since Helena and her sister were illegitimate, they did not have his surname on their record. So, it matches who was on her Ohio death certificate. But if you're searching high and low, not having any luck, that would be one possibility that they could be illegitimate, and that's why they might not be showing up under the name you might expect. So this is where we started with William Schmid, and we didn't know who his parents were when we started. And this is what we found out. So with the accessibility of church records, censuses, and others, and a little bit of digging, this is what can be done. There's more that can be done on both sides of this tree, but this is just shows a little bit of how you can take the family further back in the old country. So, and this is a picture of the family that we researched. So the son William, he's at the top left in the back, and the parents Albert and Helena are in the middle, surrounded by 7 of their other children. And before we finish, I just wanted to mention some of the resources that we have here. So this is the homepage of our website, and using the search bar at the right, you can search our collection to find additional books that we have related to Baden-Wurttemberg, and the red bottom for our resources. That'll take you to a list of our databases. So there are free databases that you can utilize from home, as well as on-site ones that we have here in person at the library. We have 25 of those. So things like Ancestry, newspapers.com, Find My Past, and lots of others. And we also have free databases that are available to be used from anywhere. One of those is Percy, which is a periodical source index. That's a subject index of local history and genealogy periodicals. So that can be a helpful resource as you research your ancestors from Baden-Württemberg. And we have some previously recorded programs on Percy and some of our other databases on our YouTube channel. So to summarize, when you're hunting for your ancestors in this area, research as much as you can in the United States first. Gather all your clues that you can find within censuses, church records, naturalizations, passenger lists. Think about occupations. The occupations that they had when they came over could potentially tell you a lot about which area they might have come from, whether they were a woodcutter or a winemaker. So church records and immigration records are going to be key. So be sure to familiarize yourself and leverage those digital collections on Family Search, Archeon, and Matricula, and become familiar with how German words and script look to be able to more easily translate and decipher the records that you find. So take advantage of the word lists and handwriting guides within the Family Search Wiki. That can be helpful. Boundary changes can be a challenge, so take your time analyzing the geographic area, what it looked like in the past, and what it looks like now. So that kind of finishes us up. We're always happy to help with recommendations and search strategies, so these are the places where you can find us. And that brings me to the end, so I'm glad to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Kate. That's such a really good intro, a lot of really great content and really awesome examples. So thank you. We do have a couple questions in here. The first person has said that, and this was a little earlier in the presentation, they were referring to your examples from the 1920 and 30 census reports. Do you mind clarifying which one reported immigration date and which one reported naturalization date?
Yeah, so I think in the 1930 census, that was when William said that he had come over in 1915, which didn't make sense because we found him in 1910 and 1900. But in 1920, by that time, William was living with his wife and his own kids. And that's when he said that the parents were from Baden. But if we look at the 1920 census for the parents, they reported themselves as being from Württemberg.
Great. Okay, so before I get to the next question, I had answered this in the Q&A, so this person should be able to see my response, but I'm going to verbally say it. Diane had asked, how can I find information about German immigrants who may have returned to Germany for Volksdeutsch in the late 1930s? There are a lot of factors as to where those records live. So please send us an email with a little bit more specifics like names, dates, places, what the situation with the Nazi regime was with that family. So yeah, send us an email and we'll give you some advice. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info, which I'm going to put that in the chat. And if any would like a copy of the chat, send us an email for that as well. Okay, the last question. I'm not sure if this person was asking about the recording or something else that maybe you mentioned, Kate, that I might have missed, but Patricia was asking, will the transcript also contain maps? If it's the recording we're talking about, yes, it will. It's a video on YouTube, which I'll put the link to that in the chat. But was there something from your presentation that this might be referring to?
Not that I can think of, but if there are specific maps that you're interested in, feel free to send us an email and I'll be glad to help point you in the right direction for that. So
Great. So that was the last question. A lot of people in the chat are saying thank you and saying how informative it was. So thanks, Kate. Such a
thank you.
great presentation. And thanks everybody for joining us. As I said a moment ago, if you would like a copy of the chat, or maybe you have some burning questions that come to you in the middle of the night after this presentation, please send us an email. I put it in the chat a few times, but as I said, it is genealogy@acpl.info. Since I don't see any more questions, I guess we'll wrap up. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.